In Season 2 of the Nested Healing Podcast, From Surviving to Thriving, we will take you with us on our journey to the many nourishing lands of healing. With a new guest for each episode, we will get to embark on each of their healing journeys, with their curiosity being, what challenges did they face, and just how did they manage to come up on the other side? From self-love and acceptance, all the way to dance and movement, we will explore the myriad of healing components shining in each of our guests' stories. How can we relate and apply this to our own lives? How can we brighten our light through a dark tunnel? Stay with us on our beautiful deep dive into healing. Hi everybody, welcome to today's Nested Healing Podcast episode. Today we have Jen speaking with us. Hi Jen, how are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks, Angelina. How are you?
I'm doing good. Very good.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you like to give the audience kind of a basis or background of who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jen. I'm the founder of Nested Integral Coaching Constellation. I'm also a certified coach. Also a student in grad school on the path to becoming a marriage and family therapist. Let's see, what are the other ways you could know me? I'm also a mom of two. And I'm also a person, an individual who has their own personal story of being impacted by and healing from interpersonal trauma.
Mhm. So, what would you say this journey of healing began for you?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Um, I think that part of where it began was in having a safe other person to start processing some of it with. So for me, it began in coaching. That was when my healing really began. But I think before I really start there, I kind of want to go back to kind of how the trauma started and some of my maybe false starts at healing, or maybe they weren't false starts. Maybe they were just the first layers before the deep healing began.
Mhm.
But yeah, and my trauma starts, you know, really generationally. I'm not the first person in my family to be impacted by trauma. It's kind of a family legacy that goes up our family tree as far as I know, our family tree goes. So there's a certain sense of growing up in a childhood where trauma was occurring, but it wasn't identified or noticed as such. It was just considered normal. So that kind of feels like where the childhood started, right? So I grew up with 9 out of 10 childhood ACEs in a household that was also struggling financially, and in a household where the legacies of intergenerational trauma were showing up in ways that both my generation, like myself and my siblings, the children, and also the generation of parents, didn't really have any understanding or awareness of at the time.
Mhm.
So starting there, I feel like that's an important part to mention because that sort of normalization of things that are kind of traumatic became the seeds that grew into traumas that happened when I was an adult.
Mhm.
So the intergenerational piece, it continues until there's an interruption in that cycle, until there's some healing and an intervention to do things differently.
Mhm. So, what would you say were some, I guess, reactions to that trauma and how that kind of showed up for you as a child and also after your childhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually describes it so precisely. That's exactly what it was like at first. There wasn't access to healing yet at that time in my life. It was coping mechanisms, survival strategies, reactions to trauma, right? Um, it was lots of ways of finding ways. It's like a really little young person to be able to manage really big survival responses that were happening inside of me that I had no explanation for. And that led me to lots of ways of trying to cope. Some of them eventually ended up being, self-medicating and numbing with substances. Some ended up being fairly avoidant patterns of withdrawing from people close to me in my life that were some of the sources of trauma. So kind of leaving that situation or leaving my sort of like presence or awareness, any way to sort of feel like I could move further from the felt impact. Those were the early ways, those were the early reactions. Um, and I think for me, it felt what I was really moving away from was stuff that felt not just painful, but also confusing, overwhelming, stuff I was really unable to process alone at that time. And that's actually a working definition of trauma that we can use is a negative event that has such an impact that the individual can't be with or process the feelings alone that can cause trauma. And so I could name and list what some of the specific events were, but even besides naming the events, it's really more of like what was the response and reaction that occurred inside of me. That's where it became trauma and not just an adverse event.
Mhm.
Yeah. So yeah, through childhood when I was younger, um, I think more of that withdrawal and isolating was kind of the way for me. And then towards my late teens, it became sort of that substance use to kind of numb some of the trauma response feeling, became some of the early ways I coped with trauma.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So would you say that you were perhaps maybe in a flight mode, maybe a lot of the time?
Yeah. I actually spent way more time in fight, flight, or freeze than I did feeling regulated as a kid.
Mhm.
Yeah, and into the teens and early adulthood. And that's part of the normalizing part in the household and through all the generations that I was mentioning. We would walk on eggshells around certain family members to not get their attention or their anger or their reactivity. And that wasn't considered a problem. That was just considered the normal way to survive in our house, that kind of thing, right? Um, yeah, so the nervous system constantly being dysregulated.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And learning what worked for your environment. Yeah.
Yeah.
How would you say, because of course, when we're children, we have models in front of us. So we have our parents or we have some sort of figure. How did perhaps maybe your parents or other people around you, family members, friends, influenced the way you reacted to things, or even, how would I say this, even understood what was going
Mm, yeah. I think one of the things I learned pretty quickly when I was young, was that just because I observed something didn't necessarily mean an adult in my life was willing to hear it. Yeah, I remember like real specific conversations, that I'd have with my mom when I was maybe 12. And some of the things that I was seeing and noticing weren't exactly welcomed conversation topics. They were kind of shut down for many reasons, maybe not wanting to look at or change behaviors, maybe disagreeing with me, maybe feeling so busy and working so many hours I didn't have time. But whatever the reasons were, those conversations weren't dialogue opening. Instead, I was receiving this really kind of shut down reaction. So I think the message I internalized through that was um, that maybe observing and noticing any sort of disruptive patterns or how we might improve them wasn't a viable path. So collaborating wasn't a viable path towards healing in my childhood. And so it really had me double down on that withdrawing strategy at the time. Like, well, I'll just retreat further into myself. Next time I notice something's wrong, I won't say anything. Maybe I'll take it to my journal, maybe I'll take it to my creative writing, but I wasn't finding that those kinds of conversations were very welcomed by the adults in my life when I was young. And eventually we had some really big ruptures, my mom and I, to the point that, was kicked out of the house and bounced around to multiple different guardians, in a couple of different states in a very short period of time of a few months when I was 16. Eventually landed with a grandparent, but went through a couple other stops along the way first. And that was really disorienting. At the time, there was so much to process around that sort of feeling of exile. And there was so much grief around like the loss of relationship with my sisters. And then there was that tumbling sort of not knowing where I was going to land and being so withdrawn inside of myself, not bringing my problems to adults. So you can see how I was really setting myself up to be quite vulnerable to future trauma. And that's actually kind of my experience of how some of that compounded.
Right.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, I mean, I experienced sexual assault when I was 17. I didn't tell anybody. I had already developed this pattern of I just keep all this in. I just keep this to myself. I use some substances so it doesn't feel too overwhelming, that type of thing, um, which landed me in my first rehab when I was a young adult. And so my years from 19 to 21, instead of like college and um, that first drink when you turn 21, that type of thing, I was already in recovery, had already gone through substance abuse, and was spending time in rehabs and AA during those years. So that was kind of my first opportunity for healing, I would say. And it also helped me interrupt that pattern of I just keep everything in, I just don't tell anybody. It did get me talking about it. So I think that was maybe some of the best things that AA and rehab had to offer to me was having a sponsor, working some steps, being able to look at my life and have somebody I could share these things with, and it would open a conversation. So it was a real corrective relational experience compared to, I think, how I'd felt growing up, where I was like, oh, I can't talk to anybody about these things. I have to keep them in.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So you felt some sort of community at that point?
Yeah. And that was a really healing experience. Now, there were other things about it that were not so healing for me, or not so complete in their healing. And I think that was the really narrow focus on the substance being the problem, right? That it was actually the substance use that was the problem. I came later to realize it was the trauma that preceded it that caused that survival response action, that caused the self-medicating, that caused what looked like addictive behavior. So like I eventually went all the way to the root to identify the trauma and my reaction to it as the problem. But I didn't have that understanding as a young adult going to rehab. So I think it was a little incomplete because it was missing that trauma-informed lens.
Right.
And so, removing the substance, and now I'm sober, but I don't have at that point healthy relationships. And I still have a lot of unresolved trauma in myself and in my family. So the healing isn't there yet, just the abstinence. So that was maybe the first sort of wave of healing was um, the sort of identified problem, I guess I would say, that AA pointed me to, which was, oh, it's your drinking that's the problem.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you recall any, I guess, moments where you kind of saw signs like this is kind of not complete? There's something missing here. Did you ever get that?
I think it was in hindsight that I started to realize it. I think at the moment, at the time, um, I really believed, right? I was getting a lot of messaging of, basically alcohol is the problem. That's my problem. That's the problem, right? and that if I can just stay sober one day at a time, no matter what, things are going to be better. And they were better in some ways, but not in all ways. But I think I really believed it at the time and wanted that to be true. And I stayed for a really long time. You know, I stayed in AA for 12 years. So it was a really long time. It became a lifestyle at a certain point. And there were ways in which my life was pretty stable during that period of being sober through AA. I, would run meetings and attend meetings regularly and got married, had kids, did all kinds of different life milestones as a person who was sober in AA. But it's this intergenerational trauma piece that wasn't addressed. It was like the unseen part of the iceberg that was below the surface of the water. I really didn't know it was still operating down there. At that time, I didn't have that awareness yet.
Right.
But it certainly did bubble up in ways that I'm now noticing are pretty predictable, right? So it's like I grew up in a childhood home that had 9 out of 10 aces, with parents who had, their own like substance or mental illness or violence, abuse history type problems, and with kids who ended up with those problems and then ended up getting married, you know, to somebody who was also sober, who had that history of family problems. And although we were both sober, we ended up recreating basically the same intergenerational trauma legacy that we grew up with, right? So, unfortunately, in early childhood, when we were still married, our kids had, a lot of aces too. They have 8 out of 10 aces. So, they've seen violence in the home. They've experienced, lots of specific things that we had in our home growing up, each of us in our own homes growing up, and that we ended up subconsciously recreating in our marriage. So we saw that trauma piece played out, right? It was almost like a automatic script. It was an automatic pattern. And like you were mentioning with the adults that things were modeled off of in childhood, right? Some of this subconscious stuff came up because it's what we had seen when we were young and impressionable. And part of those things also informed our attachment patterns, right? And bringing that unresolved insecure attachment and that unresolved intergenerational trauma into our marriage produced a trauma-filled environment. So sobriety was not a complete answer to interrupting intergenerational trauma.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys recreated what you knew, what you guys were comfortable with.
Yeah.
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 Wow. Hmm. So you realize this in hindsight. So after all of that has happened.
Yeah. In hindsight. And it really took a complete crisis to interrupt that again, right? Because again, it wasn't the kind of trauma that we were super aware of. It was just like when I was a kid and my parents weren't aware of that trauma. We weren't aware of it either, when we were new parents of young children. We weren't intentionally creating trauma, obviously, right? But we had a lack of awareness of what was seeming normal to us was actually causing trauma, right? Um, and those patterns shifted slowly, kind of over the course of our marriage, right? So like over a 10-year marriage, the first half was fairly normal, and symptoms started to escalate, behaviors started to escalate. My ex eventually got diagnosed with a mental illness, eventually became violent. These weren't things that were there at the beginning of the marriage. These were things that the marriage grew into over time, right? And all through that, because of my upbringing, it was really easy for me to normalize that, right? It was when the violence first started, it was really easy to go into the eggshell pattern that I know how to do, to try to think I can somehow prevent triggering it, right? But that was a pattern I learned in childhood. Yeah. So it was those slowly over time we ended up recreating the childhoods we'd each experienced in our own separate families. But it was kind of an evolution.
Mhm.
Yeah. And what it really took for that to become different was well, really when a line was crossed where it was actually one of my kids who was hurt in a pretty significant way. That's what triggered, divorce, restraining orders, like a whole separate new sort of journey on healing. And this is where it wasn't so much sobriety that was the main saving grace. It wasn't the main, like, oh, this is the main problem and this will be the main solution. As a matter of fact, sobriety stopped being my solution for a little bit after the divorce. Once again, I had so much dysregulation and I had so much so many things that I could not process. I had so much new trauma from the marriage that I went back to self-medicating for a while. So I actually had a relapse around that point and then ended up getting sober again. And this time, instead of getting sober for the sake of getting sober, I started on a path of healing. So this is where being able to actually resolve trauma and be able to work with my nervous system, be able to improve like boundaries and safety and relationships in my life to be healthier. That was a much deeper, more to the root style healing, and that became the new priority after my divorce.
So, with your story, you encountered multiple wake up calls, and so you went to AA, you did that, and you also gained kind of like a stable life after that, but didn't really touch on the basis of all of that uh, trauma resulting into the substance abuse. And then another wake up call in your marriage. I noticed too the stability. So you talked about in the beginning of your story, you didn't have stability at all and you felt kind of excommunicated from your family, which is a
Yeah.
huge and it's a bigger deal on a child and their system.
Mhm.
And you build stability after that in your marriage. After that came to an end and you didn't have stability in that sense, um, how were you feeling? And what kind of things did you do in result to those feelings?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it felt very similar to how I felt, in those teen years when I was kicked out and lived with many different guardians, is that like so much happening internally, both emotionally and, with my nervous system, really not finding any way to feel any safety or rest or security or stability in any sense, not internally in my own emotions or thoughts, and not externally in like, I have roots somewhere and I have stability somewhere, right? So those were both really destabilizing periods. Um, and from a trauma perspective, I'd also just been through, several years of really progressively increasing trauma that was really chronic. It wasn't a single incident that ended my marriage that was traumatic. It was out of 10 years of being together in the last 2.5, it was very increasingly traumatic, right? So it was quite a big trauma I'd come out of. And so I also had, just like when I was younger, when I came out of that childhood trauma, I also had at this period that just overwhelmed and confusing, sort of, I can't be with this, I can't process this alone kind of feeling. And that's exactly why it led to relapse in that time period, because it was the exact same internal sensation of just unprocessed trauma that I'd had before. So I already had a pretty good internal sort of instinct towards, I know how to stop this feeling from feeling. I know how to numb this out, right? So that became my solution again at that time. Um, And when I eventually came towards finding what I'd say, like the first time I found like real healing, that like really got to the root of the trauma and not just the substances, um, that changed everything. That was really what changed everything. And that was when, I met my coach, right? So, um, we worked together, meeting together weekly for 2.5 years, and then we still meet. We just reduced it to every other week and then every 3 weeks, like slowly reducing it. But it was weekly for 2.5 years in the beginning. And that was the most intense healing period for me. I went through so many different waves of healing there. And one of them had to do with this sort of hindsight perspective that I've kind of been mentioning so far. Being able to really sort of look back at my life, look back at different traumatic situations I'd been through, and then what were the reactions that occurred inside of me? What were the survival responses that occurred? And be able to kind of put a timeline together and actually see how impactful trauma had been in my life. And so this understanding that I've just been sharing with you, over the last few minutes, is something that really came into a more clear picture instead of a big, jumbled up, confusing, overwhelming amount of sensations. Being able to take that jumbled up sensations and organize it into a way where like I can actually look at it without becoming overwhelmed. That's some of the beginning work of coaching, right? Um, and some of the things that were so impactful about that opportunity to work with a coach in that way really had to do with having someone else to help hold it with me.
Mhm.
I didn't have all of that insight. I didn't have all of that perspective. I didn't have any healing at that moment when I started coaching. All I had was the jumbled up mess that I couldn't be with by myself. And I could bring that in whatever little stories came out of my mouth in each session, I could bring that confusing, jumbled up mess there, and we could hold it together and slowly over time make sense of it together. So it was a very like relational process to be in
Mhm.
that together for one. And then for two, the other thing that was really amazing about starting to work with a coach in that way is I was also at the same time, I wasn't just talking, I wasn't just looking at my story. My coach was giving me different practices and tools to be able to use and try. So I was also at the same time learning how to be with the sensations in my body by doing body scan meditations. I was also studying the nervous system and learning like what are these experiences I'm feeling, right? All of this jumbled up survival responses happening inside, I could actually start to distinguish them like, oh, this is sympathetic, part of my nervous system. This is fight or flight, or oh, this is a really low collapse state. This is dorsal vagal. And how do I get back to the middle from here? I was starting to learn how to be able to do that. So I think what was really so impactful and healing about coaching is that I was gaining that relational support to be with what I couldn't be with alone. I was getting that insight. And then at the same time, I was like building skills and competencies that helped me to heal.
Mhm. Right. And that's when you really, I guess, took in your body or recognized your body,
Mhm.
your heart, your mind,
Yes. Yeah.
which you might have been running away from before.
I was 100% running away from it. Yeah. In my earlier years, I was telling you about this avoidance and withdrawal pattern of kind of turning inward away from others. But I was also doing that withdrawal pattern inside of myself too. It wasn't safe for me to be with my emotions or sensations when I was in a lot of trauma. So I was retreating really up into my head, up into my thoughts, and I was very dissociated from what I was feeling in those years. So bringing that back online, so reconnecting with more of myself became a really important part of the healing as well. Yeah.
Which is a crucial part of your journey.
Mhm.
Got awareness before of substances and that being the corporate. But this was a whole different situation. And I can only imagine the possible grief that you felt and kind of that second, maybe wake up call or second really big event. Um, a lot of grief.
Mm.
How was it having this feeling or having those feelings similar to that?
but also trying to love yourself and listen to yourself. Was it crashing or clashing in any ways, or was it not that bad? How was it for you?
Such a great question. Yeah, as you're talking about the grief, there was so much grief, and also so much pain. Um, and there was some anger that was not super in my awareness and certainly didn't feel very expressible, but that felt really sort of like stuck in my body. Um, so I think that's part of why I had experienced being alone with my sensations of trauma as overwhelming as there were so many competing things happening at once, right? Um, and I think that, at a certain point, having the commitment to and the sort of belief in the possibility of, I think it really started with hope, which I did not have at coaching session number one necessarily. It was sort of like, I got to give this a try. Like, why not? Like, something has to change. But I don't know that I fully had hope in my possibility for healing in the beginning. But over time, and, few months in after like working with different practices and finding some relief in things, when I started to get a little bit of results, that's when I was like, oh, I think that I can work through this, right? Like this trauma is digestible and resolvable. These emotions are, something I can process. And this story is something I can share. Like I started to have some hope that those things were possible. And once I did, I became pretty dedicated to it. I think I became like quite tunnel vision focused on it, where it really kind of governed my life a little bit. It was like almost every decision I made in those early healing years was about, is this supporting my healing or is it in the way of it? Right. And so I think like you're talking about like loving yourself and really like supporting yourself through it. Constantly having that question at the forefront of my mind with every decision I made, every decision from what relationships or friendships to be in, to where to live, to how to spend my free time, to what books to read. Every decision had to do with, in that time period for me, is this supporting my healing or is it in the way of it? And that real strong commitment to my healing helped me make tons of micro decisions throughout my days all the time that were moving me towards that path of healing, and it's like a plant, like, in a window or on a patio that's like partial shade and it will start to grow like towards the sun, right? Like I was just pointed towards healing um, in every little decision. And there was still definitely grief and pain and anger and all kinds of things there. But what I started to see as I was making that new pattern is that the old pattern of like withdraw from that, like, oh, that's pain, withdraw from that, started to disintegrate and go away. And instead, the new pattern was, oh, that's pain. Can I be curious about it? Like, oh, this is so much grief. Can I be compassionate with that? And so I was starting to learn how to sort of be with it instead of like recoil from it. And that changed a lot. That's how I was able to move through and metabolize things because it takes being with it.
Which is very admirable. It's like the opposite of abandoning yourself, which
Mhm.
I respect. I love to hear that. What would you say are some big lessons you made or learned in coaching or your time
Mm.
in that sector of your life?
Yeah. Um, I think I think some of the biggest lessons I learned were about finding the right fit. That feels like the best starting point, right? Um, the first coach I met was not a good fit for me. So being able to know that and say, oh, let's try again, right? I met with one coach and she was lovely. It's not like there was anything wrong with her as a person, but somehow we didn't connect in the first call. And I think her sort of style, again, nothing wrong with her. I'm sure she's a fabulous coach, but something about her style had me feeling kind of unseen in that call and kind of like maybe her agenda mattered because she knew what she was doing, and there was less room for me to show up in the order I wanted to with all my confused jumble mess, right? And that's what I needed, was somebody who could be okay with how I was showing up, meet me where I was at, right? And I kind of had that inkling with my very first coach call I ever had with the first coach I was paired with. That was like that childhood pattern of like, oh, I can't bring this to the adults because they don't want, this is not a conversation opener. I had that sense. And so I did not proceed with the coaching engagement with that person. Um, the way that I originally found a coach was through a nonprofit. And I was a participant there receiving services, and they said, do you want to do coaching? And I said, sure, yeah, I want to do coaching. And they matched me with one person, and it just wasn't the right fit. So I told the person who did the matching, I'm like, I'm really sorry. Like, I don't want to cause problems, but I don't think that that's going to work out. So she matched me with somebody else, and that person is my current coach. That's the person who changed my life. So I think that's like a big takeaway, is like, it has to feel right. And there may not be any real um, logical or rational reason why somebody is or is not the right fit. It's a feeling, right? So I think, yeah, connecting with somebody where it feels right. It's really important because trauma is such a sensitive subject. Um, so feeling right. And then I think the other thing is being able to bring your big, confusing, jumbled mess, right? Being able to show up exactly as you are and not trying to pretend you're in a different spot than you're at. That's really important. And then from there, it's really a relational experience of holding that big jumbled mess together and sort of finding, like, what are the pain points? What are the growth edges? What's the opportunity? What's the skill or practice that could help this person have relief today? And it might not be the same practice they need in 6 months, but what's going to help today? And that's a co-created process between coach and client. So finding a coach who can really attune to you and meet you where you are, not where they think you should be, right? Like that's a big piece of it. And from there, just knowing every journey is going to look unique. There's a certain order in which my healing happened, and it might be a different order for somebody else. It might be completely different topics or skills for somebody else. So it's really something that is personal, and it's about what are you ready for today, right? And your capacity builds over time so that you become ready for things you weren't ready for at the beginning later on. Yeah. Those are the biggest things I learned from coaching.
And they're very important. And it's also another way you're not abandoning yourself. Because you could say, oh, I'm just going to go with this person. I don't want to cause any havoc. But that's also an admirable thing that you did, is saying, no, actually, this doesn't feel good to me. I'm going to try to choose someone else. Hopefully that works out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, that's more process of coaching, what I learned, but content wise, I learned so much. Like I said, study the nervous system and attachment and intergenerational trauma, and a different lens on substance abuse that's more about the trauma response rather than the so-called addiction model, right? Like I learned a ton, all of it, because it was what was relevant to my life in that moment, and it was what was coming up. And the way my coach and I would work with that is, of course, in dialogue and conversation when we're in sessions, but then also in like sort of independent study, like, okay, let's read, Attachment in Psychotherapy. Let's read that book. Or let's read Focusing in Clinical Practice. Let's learn this focusing skill. Let's reconnect with this felt sense. And those became conversation starters that also set me on my own sort of path of study. So this is where I was studying for my own healing in the moment. But these became foundations when I became a coach later of some of the sources for coaching I would have for working with others in the future. So that sort of like independent study, paralleling coaching was a big part of my journey. And then, of course, practices and skill building, right? Doing things like working with different types of meditations. I mean, I spent a solid year I'm sure it was probably at least a solid year where the meditation that I was most using was a body scan. It was just, can I connect to the sensations in my body regularly? And then later other types of meditations. But yeah, really, really working with building skills that helped me heal.
Wow. You learned a bunch of skills. Would you say that coaching made you, or your coaching sessions and how much progress you made inspired you to also be a coach yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And yet it also happened so incrementally, you know? It's actually kind of a funny story. I remember my coach suggesting to me at some point, way before I decided to become a coach, maybe a year before I decided to, something like, I think you might be good at coaching. Maybe you could look into it. And I was like, no, I have more of my own healing to do first. I'm not ready for that. He's like, okay. And like another year of healing goes by, and then all of a sudden, I really got to this point. I could recognize that it just felt different inside of myself. It was like a certain capacity I'd gotten to, plus a certain level of healing. Healing is never done. It's going to be lifelong. Like I still have things I'm working on today, but I got to like some certain critical mass point where like the unresolved baggage of trauma that I had was no longer like this big, confusing, painful, jumbled mess, right? Like I'd resolved it enough that it was like, that wasn't the big obstacle of my life anymore. And with this new expanded capacity, what happened was all of a sudden I just really felt like my cup was sort of overflowing with healing, and like maybe I didn't need to use all of it for myself anymore. Like I just had a little extra to give. And that's when I signed up to, take the certification trainings to become a coach, when I felt like, I have a little extra now. Isn't that interesting, right? Where for years I've been constantly consuming materials and immersed in practices and guiding every decision in my life based on, is this supporting my healing or not, right? Um, and all of that I was taking in was needed just to process my own trauma. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, this is a maintenance level. Like I can fully breathe now. I'm not underwater at all. Yeah.
Wow. That is so cool. That's awesome. Mhm. So, Jen, how was it becoming a coach? How
Mm.
was that journey for you?
Becoming a coach was a really amazing journey for me. I'm so glad that I did it, not just because I'm a coach now, but just that year-long process of becoming a coach was its own transformation. That was really kind of beautiful. Um, so I went through a coaching school called New Ventures West, and it's a year-long program in a cohort. So you're with the same group of people for 12 months. It's hybrid, like some of it's in person in San Francisco, some of it's online, and some of it is asynchronous, that you're like working with your clients sort of in between these retreat style sessions. And over the course of that year, like one of the ways that program opens is really doing your own work, right? It's really like each person who's there to learn how to be a coach is first doing their own practices and really working with their own development first. And then you begin to work with clients. And so I think the reason I mentioned that so explicitly is because that's what I'd been doing for those years before I became a coach. In the one-on-one coaching with my coach, is I'd been working on my own healing and development. But when I entered into the coaching school, I was doing it with this meta lens of being able to view myself the way a coach would, right? Being able to see, all of a sudden I could look back over the past few years of working with my coach, and I could see what we'd done from his perspective, different from my perspective, right? So that perspective shift of understanding the model of coaching and the purpose of practices, and being able to attune to each specific client and bring what they need, not just to have the same thing for every single client. It's not like every single client needs to do body scan. No, I needed to do body scan, right? Other clients may be working with a different type of meditation or a whole different practice. And so being able to see that from that lens was really helpful. And there was something really special about that, to be honest, to be able to kind of see that like peek behind the curtain of like, what is it like to be a coach? And all of a sudden I realized I was like, oh, it's not like I just happened to find somebody who knew the exact things that I needed to know. It was, I found somebody who knew how to find out what I needed and bring that, right? So that was really pretty cool. And then learning how to coach, that's what we spent most of the year on in that coaching school. And having my first clients, like I have such a soft spot in my heart for all of my clients, really, but especially for those first clients when I was learning how to coach and was in my practicum and working with those clients. And I think the hardest thing for me with those first clients when I was learning was how to end coaching. I was like, when we got done with all of our sessions and we were complete and there were no more sessions left, I just remember like how sad it was to be like, oh, this is our last session. I'm not going to keep working with you and seeing you every other week or every week. And yeah, I think that was the hard part. It's like I wanted to keep everybody in my life more long term. Uh, but yeah, basically what happened in learning how to become a coach is I also realized there are so many different areas that people coach. There's different practice areas, there's different specialties and topics. Like, even though everybody that graduated from my coaching school all learned the same method, we learned the same models for development. We all work with people. People all have, complexities that are there, but they have differences and similarities just of being human. So there is something that overlaps for everybody. But also, like we each have different sort of sources for coaching and populations of focus that we work with. So like in my coaching school, there were some people who were going into executive coaching and they were going to coach CEOs. And then there was me, I was like, I'm going to coach people impacted by trauma and everywhere in between. So there's so many different applications for trauma. I mean, applications for coaching. And so one of the things I notice is I was really uniquely prepared, I think, to coach people impacted by trauma because of not only my own lived experience and my life story of experiencing and healing from trauma, but also because, like I said, in those years of coaching before I became a coach, there was all that parallel study happening, right? I was doing deep dives and learning about the nervous system. I was learning about attachment. I was learning about ACEs. I was learning about addiction, right? And by going through and really studying those became my starting sources for coaching. So I knew a little bit more from a lived experience, plus from a sort of theoretical and research perspective, what is that jumbled up mess of confusing? I can't be with this, right? Like those were the words I had for it, but I got to learn a little bit more about how part of that was disorganized attachment and part of that was dysregulation and part of that was, survival responses that had poor coping patterns. Like I need to numb and self-medicate this feeling, right? So I got to be able to bring those sources for coaching as a way of understanding people through the lens of trauma.
And creating like your own recipes for each individual.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you also in the beginning talked about becoming a therapist. And how was that for you?
Yeah, great question. So that's the new transition I'm in currently. I guess if I back up a little bit to the coach, I'll say this. When I set out to become a coach, it was because I wanted to help people. It was because like I had a little bit extra left over to give, and I thought I can help other people heal now. But I didn't know exactly what form that would take. I just sort of trusted the process, and I was like, let me just go learn the skills and then I'll figure it out. And towards the end of my coaching certification, and as I was thinking through, like, who am I going to help? How am I going to help them? That's when the idea for the nonprofit came up, right? It was like, well, I don't really want to build a private practice. Like, I really want to make coaching accessible for people who wouldn't have had access otherwise. So the nonprofit model, came into being and just went through the steps that it takes to file and build a nonprofit, right? So We had to get a board of directors. We had to have a mission statement, right? We had to apply for tax exempt status, all those sort of administrative pieces of starting a nonprofit really started us sparking those conversations of like, well, what is our mission? What's important to us, right? Crafting that mission statement really aligned who are we going to help and why and how, right? So going through that process and founding the nonprofit really zeroed in on, we're going to work with people impacted by interpersonal trauma. And built a program. And we have a group program, the repair program, that introduces lots of different skills. So remember, I was telling you, like, really early on in my coaching and in my healing, that's what was providing the immediate relief that eventually brought the hope, was developing those skills and capacities, right? And there was more work that was done on an individual level and then a one-on-one level. But those skills provided the first relief that gave me some hope that, like, oh, I can heal. Oh, I can be with this. Like, oh, that is supporting me to do this. So our first group program was a collection of skills, and that's the repair program. And then people also can work on their own development and healing with one-on-one coaches alongside that. But basically, that mission of like, we're going to help people with the impact of interpersonal trauma. We had our pilot in the first year. It was a great success. It really helped people. We repeated it again a couple times the next year, and we're still repeating it. Still the same program. We've made improvements over time. We've added a workbook. Our first pilot didn't have a workbook to go with it. Different things like that. But as we've been growing in this program, one of the things I realized last year was, well, maybe there's more I can do to be trauma informed, right? So I started looking around at like, what's the next training I'm going to do? What's the next certification? And I was considering some other coaching certifications that were trauma based. I was considering some that were interventions you could only learn if you were a therapist. Like you can't even apply to that school if you're not a therapist. And that's what really started me on that therapy path, where I thought, well, I want access to all of the tools for trauma. Not just ones that are approved for coaches, and then there's ones that are approved for therapists. I'm like, I want to be able to have access to learn all of it. So that's why I started with, becoming a therapist. I didn't find anything lacking in what I was doing with clients as a coach, but there's a little bit that's kind of excluded and reserved specifically for therapists. And as I started researching that more, I was realizing, there's also lots of more in-depth trauma treatment modalities. What we currently have in repair is a trauma support group. That's different, right? It's coaching and psychoeducation. But there's also trauma treatment protocols and modalities that I can learn as a therapist. So now I'm in school to become a therapist, and I'm in my practicum again. So just like a few years ago when I was in a coaching practicum, I have therapy clients that I work with now that I love, and that I also don't want our engagements to end. Is how I feel every time I'm with clients. But yeah, so I'm learning another approach to being able to support people in healing from trauma.
Wow, that's such a beautiful path to take.
Mm.
And I don't know if the audience, if I should say this, but I have been in repair and it's affected me in so many good ways. I could cry if I think about it too much.
Mm.
But your impact is big on me, and I know it's big on other people, and especially, people that do come from or have experienced trauma. But I just want to thank you, Jen, for the work that you've done. And there is also a previous podcast that we did, um, but the a person we were interviewing talked about, angels. Do you have
Mm.
an angel in your story? And Jen, I think you are an angel in my story. You really are. And I don't want to cry, but
Oh,
I
that's
just,
so sweet, Angelina. And honestly, I feel the same way, like it's like my coach is an angel in my story, but also like even the way that the nonprofit came into being, or the program, or my path to healing, or becoming a therapist, or being in a cohort of repair with that particular group of faculty and that particular group of participants, and it's different every time, right? I also feel really personally impacted by that in a great way, right? My healing continues to evolve. Like I said, like I got to the point where I processed enough of it that it's not a confusing, painful, jumbled mess, but it's still also a lifelong journey, and it's still always unfolding. And yeah, I get just as much out of being in those repair cohorts with you all as you're saying you're getting from it too. So it's just this wonderful sort of like, who's helping who here? Like we're all just supporting each other, right? We're all just in this together, and healing can be a collective process as well as an individual one.
Mhm. I think too, listening to you, I'm there's different ways of healing. And the biggest one I'm getting from this, at least right now, is knowledge,
Mm.
being aware. And so if you keep digging or if you keep searching, that you'll eventually end up in a place where you feel stable again, or you feel better than you did when you didn't have any clue at all. But that's one thing I'm getting from this is like your trait of just searching and finding. But I love that. And that's something I'm taking away from this interview.
Yeah, thanks for naming that. I appreciate that. Yeah. And I do love searching and finding and learning, so I'm continuing to do that, and will continue to bring new things forward. And I think that's one of the things I really love the most about any of the learning or studying that I've been doing since I became a coach, and then continued improving as a coach, and now I'm becoming a therapist. And even that has its own lifelong learning built in, right? There's continuing education credits to renew my license, both for coaching and therapy, that will keep coming up all the time. And this never-ending learning, what makes it really worthwhile is I'm not just learning it to keep it for myself, but that it's passing through to share with others.
Mhm. So with coaching, what are the top two elements that you like to bring in with your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I work specifically, with populations impacted by interpersonal trauma, there's definitely top two frameworks that I like to work with. One of them is attachment theory, and another is really studying the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. That one's less of a simple answer because there's like three theories that I really like to kind of combine in that one. It's hard to pick just one. But basically, nervous system and attachment, I think, would be the top two. And I think what's really important about those for interpersonal trauma is I think those two in particular are pretty universally impacted by people impacted by interpersonal trauma. So the attachment really has to do with basically like the relational templates that we use for all of our relationships in our whole lifespan, even when we're an adult. And those relational sort of templates or internal operating systems, they develop before we have any real memory. They develop between like 0 and 24 months. We don't have memories that young. The autobiographical memory kicks in after that. So often we don't know exactly how and why that pattern formed, but it happens in those really young ages. And like if I go back to that intergenerational trauma piece I was talking about in the very beginning, of my story, right? Like my parents had their own very traumatic and unhealthy relationship and dynamic when, my siblings and I were young. And that became part of the internal working model of what's a normal relationship before I could even talk, right? Like that's just how that works. That's how the attachment goes through. And so that piece of working with attachment is really essential when you're working with interpersonal and intergenerational trauma. because it's all happening in those pre-verbal, pre-autobiographical memory times, and it becomes predictive of how we behave in relationships, all important relationships. It doesn't necessarily affect the way that we socialize with acquaintances or colleagues that are at arm's length, although it can. But for sure, it has the deepest impact on all primary important relationships, best friends, romantic partners, parents, siblings, children, right? Those are like our strong attachment relationships, and they all become impacted by our attachment styles. And so that's a big piece in my own healing. That was a really big missing piece in breaking the cycle in my family, being able to see through coaching, like what are my attachment patterns? What aspects of healthy attachment, secure attachment were missing in my family that I didn't learn growing up, that I need to now take the conscious time and effort to learn and practice and develop as an adult. That was huge. I came from having a disorganized attachment style. There's a few different attachment styles. Basically, they fall in two different categories, like secure attachment, which is the healthy way of having relationships, or insecure attachment, which means there's some disruption. There's something that isn't quite healthy about those relationships. And there's three kinds there. Like anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, and mine was disorganized. And disorganized attachment is really characterized by having traits of both of the other two insecure, right? There's the anxious and the avoidant. Plus, there's an element of fear in close relationships. So I had that kind of style. And being able to work through that to get to the point where I could have like an internal operating system, this internal working model of what it's like to have a healthy relationship, was a really healing part of my journey. And working with clients to be able to find that for themselves is another really important piece of my work as a coach and as a therapist. And then the other piece of that intergenerational healing for me was it wasn't enough to repair my own attachment style. My children were also really impacted because, like I said, before my divorce in the early childhood, they experienced a lot of ACEs. And they also, in those early years, they inherited from me and their father, they inherited insecure attachment styles. So I learned to work through that and heal through that for myself in coaching. And then I also had that parenting aspect of how can I repair attachment with my daughters. So that's really important. There's a particular practice that I really love for attachment, that's been really impactful in my own life. And it's from a 12-step group called ACA. It's Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. And they have this practice called the Inner Reparenting Worksheet. Basically, it leads you through this sort of check-in that you can do with yourself daily, so that your inner loving parent can kind of reparent your inner child. And so there's a check-in that includes like, what are the sensations and emotions and the thoughts that are present right now? And what's the sort of like relational dialogue between the inner loving parent and the inner child that can help soothe and nurture and repair that? And over time, you can really change that internal working model that you have around your attachment style by re-parenting your inner child. So I worked with that for a long time, and found that to be really impactful. I've given that same practice to some clients who've needed to work through that, and they've found great success with it. So that's one, I think that's really impactful. And then the other, I think, is around the nervous system. People who've experienced trauma end up in a survival response, right? That's just the biological part. And this could be interpersonal trauma or not. It could be any kind of trauma. It could be, a car accident, or it could be interpersonal trauma. It could be a violent episode. It could be any kind of thing. Our biology, our nervous system is wired to keep us alive. And so a survival response is automatic. There's no choice in it. It's just what happens when you're under a really extreme threat. And part of the problem when it's something traumatic instead of something that's maybe accidental, But when it's something traumatic that happens, a lot of times your nervous system can get kind of stuck in that trauma response, and you don't know how to get back to feeling safe inside of yourself or to feel calm again. So it's like you have maybe chronic racing thoughts and PTSD-like symptoms and irregular heartbeats or, that type of thing. Is really common in trauma. So learning how to work with the nervous system and how to find a way back to being regulated and centered and feeling that spacious ability to breathe, feel safe in your body again. That's another really important one.
So, do you have any metaphors for your healing journey that you can think of?
Yeah, I do actually. There's a couple that I keep coming back around to because they seem to really like encompass what it was like for me in healing at different points. Um, One of them, these both may sound a little odd, but one of them is like imagine you're in a like runaway car, right? Like you're driving, the car's out of control, maybe the brakes are out, you're on some kind of a like windy road off like a cliffside, and there's nothing you can do to like stop or regain control of the car, and the car like completely veers off the road and like lands in the ocean, right? And this is a crisis situation, right? Like it's life or death. It's destabilizing, it's disorienting. You got survival responses going, and the car starts to sink below the water, and you're eventually able to, find a way to uh, break a window, like the seatbelt buckle or something. They're like pretty unbreakable, but like somehow by destroying the car, you're able to swim out of that window and onto the shore, and you're alone, right? And then you get to the shore, and there's finally a person there, and you're panicked, and you've just survived something traumatic, and you say something to that person about it and ask for some help, and the response that you get from that person is more judgmental and accusatory than helpful. The response is like not anything at all about your survival. The response is like, you just destroyed that property. What do you think the owner of that car is going to think about the fact that you broke that window? And people are more focused on your survival behavior than on the fact that you survived. That's kind of that really alienating, isolating kind of feeling that describes what it's like when we're more focused on punishment or blame, either through the criminal justice system or for like kind of demonizing substance addiction or something like that, where you're more focused on the behavior than on the preceding trauma that caused the behavior, right? And it's like all that you want when you get to that shore and you've survived is for somebody to say, I'm so glad you're still here. You made it.
Right. To feel seen.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and also, what other options did you have, right? You could have run into the cliffside or you could have drowned in the car, but like you had to break the window to get out, right? So there's something too about normalizing like survival, and then healing can begin. Maybe we don't need to go back so much and legislate how people survived. So there's one kind of metaphor. And then the other one I have that's more on the healing side, right? This had to do more with like working through my own attachment and intergenerational trauma patterns, more of that like long-standing multi-generation family trauma. And this is my experience of kind of like what it was like when I was in coaching and I was really committed to the work. I know I mentioned earlier, there was a certain point in time once I found just little bits of success and relief that I had a lot of hope, and I actually believed healing was possible, and I was just committed to it, right? And that even if things were really difficult then, even if it was like, man, this anger is a lot to be with, like I'm gonna be with it because I really believe I can get through the other side, right? And my metaphor for that is kind of like being in a swamp land, how it feels, right? So there's like this sense of like there's so much like mud and guck and stuff to like get through. And I imagine I'm in these like really high galoshes, right? Like you would be if you were walking through a swamp where they go up to the middle of your thigh or something, and the water's like up to your knees, and it's like just you can't even see through it. It's so murky. There's so much there, right? And being really committed to staying in that place until I'm able to resolve it and understand it and leave it, which was a very different reaction to how I used to feel about pain, which is let me escape it. Let me withdraw from it. Let me do anything to avoid it. But I think once I was really committed to my healing, it became more like, even if I'm sloshing through this and it's this big murky mess, I'm going to stay here until I can process and digest this. And that metaphor started to really evolve for me over time, over the years in my healing. And I started to realize that it was like that swamp was actually a big swamp of tears. It was pain. That was all that it was, right? That's what all that liquid was. It was like, it was my tears. It was my parents' tears. It was my kids' tears. It was my ex's tears. It was just tears. It was just so much pain. And by staying with it and being really committed to being there until it could shift was like bringing sunshine on it, right? Like my attention of like staying there and being with it, witnessing it, all that pain, that sea of mixed up, everybody's pain is all in this swamp. It became like by putting my attention on it was like slowly helping it evaporate like sun does to where eventually you have some dry land to walk on.
Wow. Wow. Those are beautiful metaphors
Thanks.
and relatable. Wow. I can't believe you came up with that. Like, that's just crazy.
Yeah,
So cool. I love it.
thanks.
So, what are some words or a message you want to leave for the audience for today?
Hmm. I think for anybody who is at the start of their healing journey, if you're not sure it's even possible, like you're in such a swamp of pain that you can't imagine ever getting out of it. I think my message would be just stick with it long enough that you can find just a couple of those skills that bring a little relief. And when the hope comes in, it's going to be its own motivator. But just hang on in there until you find that little bit of relief and really seek out, somebody that can be your partner in the journey. Coach, a therapist, a support group, whatever works for you. It might look different for each person, but finding that companionship and just holding out until you see a little bit of progress, and it will all go from there.
Thank you, Jen, for talking with us. I'm so inspired by your story, and I'm in love with the answer that you gave and also the tools that you gave to us throughout. So, thank you, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely.